Welcome back to Sunday Morning Cafe for our ongoing conversation on what builds and maintains resilience. There's a quote from Winston Churchill at about 1942 when Britain won their first battle against Germany in World War II. He was speaking to Parliament when he said, "We're not at the end. We're not even at the beginning of the end of this thing, but perhaps we're at the end of the beginning." When I was a kid, I grew up in Springfield, Illinois, which in central Illinois, if you don't know this, corn is king. In Springfield, you're never any more than a mile or two away from a cornfield. And what that meant for kids of a certain age, like middle school, high school, was jobs in the summer detasseling corn. And so the way it worked is that parents in the wee hours before the sun came up would load their kids in their car with their bags of lunch and snacks and water and drop them off where the bus was. And these buses would get loaded up and they'd go out into the country and disgorge their teenage contents into the cornfields where the dew was still dripping from the corn with the sun coming up, and the coolness of the summer morning air was still there. And kids would be in a great mood. There'd be like these songs that were sort of reminiscent of military marching songs, but with kind of off-color lyrics not meant for adults, and jokes, and people would have a really good time until about a certain time of the day. You know, after the last morsel of food was eaten from lunch and the sun was like directly overhead, what I'd call the devil of the noonday sun. And that phrase probably doesn't even need a description from me. You know, that point in the day where the last break's over with and it is hot. You know, the sun has burned off the morning dew hours and hours ago. And you're just marking time till you can get that day over with. I borrowed that phrase from the spiritual manuals and journals of saints from the Middle Ages. And anybody who's been interested or serious about the spiritual life also knows what that term devil of the noonday sun means. Because anybody who's been serious about a spiritual life has that moment where their meditation that used to seem so exuberant and so enjoyable to do now becomes dry. And you're just marking time to get your hour over with or get it in. Or that sense of a presence of God, depending on your spirituality, feels miles away. Prayer is dry. The spiritual life is dry. And from time to time, a good spiritual director will give you directions that'll help you kind of get over that roadblock, or a spiritually informed counselor can help you identify with what the problem is. But frequently, all there is to do with the spiritual devil of the noonday sun is just like what those people detasseling corn had to do. You just kind of have to get through it, one day at a time, 5 minutes at a time. Which brings me back to Winston Churchill. We're not at the end of this thing. You know, in fact, here where I live in St. Louis, Missouri, like many, many states in our nation, these COVID cases are spiking. And to make matters worse, it's getting cold and we're going to need to go indoors. And so you're hearing about this thing a lot, COVID fatigue. And the problem is, while we may be tired of COVID, COVID's not really tired of us yet. And so here we are in the middle. We're not at the beginning of this thing, but we're certainly not at the end either. We're right in the middle of it. Which brings me to mind of the work of William Bridges, who was an organizational psychologist and a researcher, and in his own right, a resilience expert. He noticed times like this when you're in the middle of the devil of the noonday sun, and he called it the desert. And in his writings, he likened it to the experience of Moses and Israel in the middle of the desert. And he identified what are the feelings of the desert. And these might sound familiar to you. Impatience, anger, sadness, loneliness. What Bridges said you want to do if you're a leader in the middle of the desert with people is you want to acknowledge those feelings. And rather than call them pathological and ask people just get over it, acknowledge it and normalize those feelings. What he'd have us do would be to sit down, and when you feel feelings like that, notice those, don't cling to them, don't chase them away, but let them pass through you as feelings are wont to do. To normalize those, that's just part of how things happen. Great leaders normalize those things And great leaders do other things as well. Great leaders also, when you're in the desert, are like Moses. They try to come up with a vision of what's to come. Remember Moses talking about that land that's flowing with milk and honey? That we're not going to be here for good. These are tough times, but you can do this. We can do this together. So what are those skill sets when the sun is directly overhead and you are in the desert? What are those practices to give you just enough for that day? Again, back to that metaphor of Moses and Israel in the desert, there was that stuff called manna that would show up for just that day, just enough for that day. What are your practices? You're 7 months into this now. What have been practices that would give you just enough nourishment, just enough refreshment for this day? Who are those people you get with that give you just enough for this day? And look how I'm punctuating time. I'm not saying just enough for a month or a week or a year, just for this day, and sometimes just enough between now and lunch. What do I need in this moment? What I'd like to suggest at this point is I want to promote my resilience toolkit that you'll find on my website. Some of you access these videos through SundayMorningCafe.com, my website. Others of you go on YouTube, and some of you, there are some retreat locations that use my videos. So if you come to my website, you will see a 15-page e-workbook with videos embedded in them. Some of you have created discussion groups around each section of these things. There are like 8 different sections with 10-minute videos. In some of those sections, I provide discussion questions for your group or for your friend and you to talk over, or just for you as an individual. In others, I don't. And for those, you could just ask yourselves, what stood out for me? What spoke to me? And let your conversation revolve around that. But to get back to, and I hope you use that, and I'd like to hear what comes of that for you. To get back to Bridges' work, he said the most important thing we can do here in the middle passageway of the desert is to provide supportive communication, to provide mutual support to one another. Great leaders, great parents, and great spouses, and great friends provide supportive communication. And what does that look like? It looks like voicing appreciation frequently and abundantly, not just for the big things, but for the small things. That's supportive communication. Supportive communication looks like engaging in reminiscence about the great times we've had in the past with an understanding that those times will be here again. Just like I talked about Moses providing that vision, supportive communication is providing that vision of what's to come that includes the wisdom that we've picked up in the desert. Some of our COVID silver linings, we want to take those with us into this new vision, what we've picked up along the way. You know, there's this tendency for people who have spiritualities to want to take God and put God into a box and make God into this tiny little idol or amulet. And most religious traditions warn us about the tendency to create a tiny little thing out of God. Because God will never stay in our boxes, but we'll bust those boxes wide open. I read a theologian once who said, the least wrong thing you can say about God is that God is love. And so with that concept, perhaps we need to not just refer to God as a noun, but to consider referring to God as a verb, as that energy and that power that flows through us as a very active thing and flows through others toward us as a very active thing. And with that in mind, that we could make of ourselves oases in this desert, to provide a kind of nourishment and a refreshment around one another, to resolve to provide that supportive communication and to provide those mutual oases for one another. And so that's our conversation for this week. I look forward to seeing you next week to see if some of you did tune in to my resilience toolkit and see what's come of that for you.